In the German military tradition, silence was discipline. The Wehrmacht operated on the Prussian principle of Auftragstaktik, mission command. Officers were given a goal and expected to achieve it with minimal guidance. But this independence came with a technological cost. At the squad and platoon level, the German army was surprisingly low-tech. German infantry squads relied on shouting. They relied on whistles. They relied on flares. When a German lieutenant needed to send a message to his captain, he didn't press a button. He sent a melder, a runner. These runners were brave men. They sprinted through artillery barrages and machine gun fire to deliver handwritten notes. Many of them died. And when the runner died, the message died with him. German tanks had radios, but the infantry did not. To the German soldier, the radio was a specialized piece of equipment, operated by a signal specialist in the rear. It was heavy, fragile, and rare. This created a battlefield that was, for the Germans, dangerously quiet and disconnected. When they looked across the lines at the Americans, they saw something that confused them. They saw an army that never shut up. German intelligence reports from Normandy and Italy noted that the Americans were chatterboxes. They used radios for everything. They broadcasted in the clear, unencrypted, for tactical movements. The Germans initially viewed this as a sign of indiscipline. They thought the Americans were unprofessional, clogging the airwaves with useless noise. They talk like they're on a telephone, one German officer noted with disdain. They believed that this reliance on technology made the Americans soft. If you jammed the radio, the Germans thought, the American soldier would be helpless. They didn't realize that the noise they were hearing was actually the sound of a military revolution. The Americans weren't just talking. They were building a web. A web of information that connected the humblest private to the mightiest general. And the Germans, stuck in their silent, isolated squads, were about to get caught in it. The United States Army in World War II was the first truly wireless army in history. While the Germans were stringing telephone wires from trees, the Americans were handing out radios like candy. The star of this revolution was the SCR-300 walkie-talkie. It was the first backpack radio that could be tuned by a simple dial. It was rugged, reliable, and had a range of several miles. But even more revolutionary was the SCR-536 hand-talkie. This looked like a large telephone handset. It was small enough to be held in one hand. It had no dial. It was preset to a single frequency. You pulled out the antenna, pressed a button, and talked. It was idiot-proof. The U.S. Army issued these by the tens of thousands. Every platoon leader, every company commander, every forward observer had one. This created a nervous system for the Army. If an American platoon ran into a machine gun nest, they didn't have to send a runner back to HQ. The lieutenant just grabbed his handset. King 2, this is King 3. Heavy fire from the Red Barn. Instantly, the company commander knew. The mortar platoon knew. The tank commander down the road knew. The German observers were baffled by the speed of the American reaction. They would attack an American outpost, expecting it to be isolated. Within minutes, reinforcements would arrive. Or artillery would fall. The Germans couldn't understand how the Americans coordinated so fast. They assumed the Americans had a pre-planned schedule. They didn't realize that the Americans were improvising in real time, conducting a massive conference call in the middle of a firefight. The sheer volume of American radio production was staggering. Motorola and other U.S. companies produced so many radios that American troops sometimes used them for personal chats. This radio indiscipline drove German intelligence crazy. They tried to listen in, but there was too much traffic. It was a wall of sound. The Germans were fighting a war of rigid orders. The Americans were fighting a war of constant conversation. And in the chaos of battle, the conversation was winning. December 1944. The Ardennes. During the initial chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans achieved a breakthrough. German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, and SS Panzergrenadiers overran American positions. In the confusion, the retreating GIs left equipment behind. A German intelligence unit, advancing with the spearhead, came across an abandoned American forward observer post. It was a goldmine. Maps, codebooks, and cigarettes. But the prize was the radio. An SCR-300 backpack radio. It was leaning against a tree, the handset dangling. And it was still on. The battery hadn't died. The static hiss filled the cold winter air. The German intelligence officer, a captain who spoke fluent English, having studied in the US or UK, put on the headset. He expected to hear panic. He expected to hear American commanders screaming retreat orders. He expected to hear the chaos of a broken army. This was, after all, the greatest German offensive of the year. They were smashing the American line. The German officer adjusted the squelch. He tuned into the frequency marked on the dial. He listened. What he heard froze his blood. He didn't hear panic. He didn't hear defeat. He heard a calm, bored voice. It was an American corporal, somewhere in the woods a mile away. The corporal wasn't screaming. He was chewing gum, or sounding like it. "Yeah, Red Leader, this is Checkmate King 2. I got eyes on those Kraut tanks. They're parked by the church. Send the mail." The German officer looked at the map. The church was exactly where his own panzer reserves were forming up for the next attack. He realized with horror that the panic was a German illusion. The Americans were retreating, yes. But they weren't blind. And they weren't silent. They were watching. And they were talking. The German captain continued to listen. He waited for the response from Red Leader. He expected a long delay. In the German army, calling in artillery on a new target required authorization. It required calculation. It took time. The voice came back on the radio within seconds. "Checkmate King 2, this is Red Leader. Shot, over. Shot, out." The German officer looked at his watch. Seconds passed. Then, the ground shook. In the distance, near the church where the panzers were parking, the world erupted. It wasn't a single shell. It was a battalion volley. 12 105mm howitzers firing simultaneously. The German officer listened to the radio again. "Red Leader, that was close. Drop 50, right 100. Fire for effect. Fire for effect. That phrase became the most terrifying sentence in the English language for the Wehrmacht. It meant that the adjustment was done. It meant that every gun within range was about to unload on that coordinate. The German officer realized the terrifying truth. The American voice on the radio, that bored, casual corporal, was not just a soldier with a rifle. He was a god of war. He had the power to summon thousands of pounds of high explosives with a few words. And he didn't need to ask a general for permission. The American system decentralized firepower. It gave the power of the artillery to the lowest-ranking man who could see the target. The German officer took off the headset. He looked at his own radio operator, who was struggling to set up a heavy, complex German field radio to contact their own HQ. They couldn't even get a signal. Meanwhile, the Americans were conducting a symphony of destruction on a handheld device. The German realized that their surprise attack was doomed. You cannot surprise an enemy who is essentially telepathic. That the chatterbox Marmy wasn't just talking. It was coordinating a level of violence that the rigid German command structure simply couldn't match. The intelligence officer wrote in his notebook, "The enemy has a devastating advantage. Their lowest ranks command their highest weapons." He knew, standing in that snowy forest, that the blitzkrieg was dead. It had been killed by the radio. When German technical intelligence units finally got their hands on the American radio equipment captured in the Bulge and Normandy, they were expecting something crude. They believed American equipment was mass-produced junk. But when they opened up the casing of the SCR-536 hand-talkie, they were stunned. It was a masterpiece of miniaturization. German field radios were heavy backpacks. They required a dedicated operator to lug them around. They used large, fragile vacuum tubes that broke easily. The SCR-536, by comparison, was science fiction. It weighed only 5 pounds. It fit in one hand. It turned on automatically when the antenna was extended. But the real shock was inside. The Americans had developed miniaturized vacuum tubes. These tiny glass components were rugged, reliable, and packed tightly into the chassis. German engineers realized that this wasn't just a radio, it was a symbol of an industrial capability that Germany could not match. Germany had brilliant scientists. They had invented the jet engine and the ballistic missile. But they couldn't mass-produce delicate electronics on this scale. They realized that the Americans were issuing these complex devices to everyone. In the Wehrmacht, a radio of this complexity would be reserved for a battalion commander. In the U.S. Army, it was given to a platoon sergeant. This ubiquity terrified the German analysts. It meant that the American Army had a sensory nervous system that extended to the very tips of its fingers. German reports noted the profligate use of batteries. The SCR-536 devoured batteries. They lasted only about a day of heavy use. The Germans, who had to ration batteries like gold, couldn't understand how the Americans could afford to treat them as disposable. They didn't see the mountains of fresh batteries arriving on the Red Ball Express trucks. The hand-talkie shock was a realization of technological asymmetry. The Germans were fighting with the best technology of the 1930s. The Americans were fighting with the technology of the future. And that technology was in the hands of 19-year-old boys who treated it like a telephone. The German military doctrine was built on hierarchy. A general commanded a colonel. A colonel commanded a captain. Orders flowed down. If a German squad leader saw a target, he couldn't just call the artillery. He had to send a runner to the lieutenant, who called the captain, who called the major. By the time the request reached the guns, the target was gone. The American radio network destroyed this hierarchy. With a radio in his hand, an American private first class, PFC, effectively outranked a German major. Why? Because the private controlled the firepower. If a scout spotted a German column, he could get on the radio net. Target of opportunity. Coordinates. The Fire Direction Center, FDC, didn't ask for his rank. They didn't ask for his pedigree. They just asked for the coordinates. This concept, every private a general, was alien to the Prussian mind. They believed that war was an art form to be conducted by the elite. The Americans treated war as a customer service transaction. The infantry was the customer, and the artillery was the service provider. The speed of this transaction was blinding. In the hedgerows of Normandy, German defenders would set up a perfect ambush. They would pin down an American patrol. In 1940, against the French or British, this would have been a victory. The enemy would have been stuck until heavy support slowly moved up. But against the Americans, the ambush would trigger an immediate, overwhelming response. Within minutes, mortar rounds would fall. Then 105mm shells. Then 155mm shells. The German ambushers found themselves fighting not just a squad, but an entire corps artillery park. The radio flattened the battlefield. It removed the friction of command. German interrogators often asked captured American GIs, "Who is your political officer? Who tells you what to think?" The GIs would look confused. "Nobody tells me what to think. But if I see a tank, I tell the artillery where it is." This independence, enabled by the radio, made the U.S. Army incredibly resilient. You couldn't decapitate an American unit by killing the leader. If the lieutenant died, the sergeant grabbed the radio. If the sergeant died, the corporal grabbed it. As long as the battery lasted, the unit was deadly. The Germans were fighting a hydra where every head had a direct line to Zeus. If the artillery was the hammer, the jag bomber, was the lightning bolt. And the radio was the conductor. The Germans terrified the world with the Stuka dive bomber in 1940. But the Stuka had to be pre-briefed on targets. The Americans perfected close air support. They put forward air controllers, FACs, in tanks and in tiny, unarmed Piper Cub aircraft. These Piper Cubs, grasshoppers, were the most feared aircraft on the Western Front. They flew low and slow. They were hard to shoot down because they were so agile. And they carried a radio. A German tank commander sitting in his Tiger II might feel invincible against American Shermans. But when he saw a Piper Cub circling overhead, he felt a pit in his stomach. He knew that the pilot in that flimsy canvas plane was talking directly to a flight of PE-47 Thunderbolts or PE-51 Mustangs circling at 10,000 feet. The German commander couldn't hear the conversation, but he knew what it meant. "I see a tiger in the tree line. Mark smoke." The Piper Cub would fire a smoke rocket. Then, the sky would fall. The P-47s would dive, unleashing rockets and 500-pound bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The radio link between the mud and the sky was seamless. German movement in daylight became suicide. If a German column tried to move on a road, a radio call would go out. Within 10 minutes, the J-boats would arrive. General Rommel himself was strafed by Allied aircraft, suffering severe injuries. He was taken out of the war not by a brilliant strategic maneuver, but by a radio call from a spotter who saw dust on a road. The Germans tried to jam the frequencies. They tried to shoot down the spotters. But there were too many radios. Too many channels. The Jabbo connection meant that the U.S. Army effectively had a three-dimensional advantage in every engagement. German prisoners often complained that it was unfair. They wanted to fight soldier to soldier. But the Americans used the radio to ensure they never had to fight a fair fight. Why charge a machine gun nest when you can just radio a P-47 to drop a bomb on it? It was efficient. It was brutal. And it was unbeatable. What truly unnerved the German intelligence officers listening to American frequencies wasn't just the volume of traffic. It was the tone. German military communication was formal. Rigid. Coded. Achtung! Feindlich Panzer in Sektor Bertavia. American communication sounded like a baseball game. The Americans used slang. They used sports metaphors. They used profanity. Hey, Red Leader, we got some krauts playing catcher in the basement of the farmhouse. How about a fastball? Roger that, sending the heat. German linguists, trained in formal Oxford English, struggled to decode this. What was a fastball? What was the heat? They realized that the Americans were so comfortable with their technology that they didn't need to be formal. The radio was just an extension of their voice. This casualness was a psychological weapon. To the starving, freezing German soldier listening in, the Americans sounded relaxed. They sounded like they were having fun. They sounded like they were winning. Base, this is king. We need some chow up here. And send some more ammo, we're having a party. A party. That's what they called a fight. This projected an aura of confidence that sapped the German will to resist. How do you fight an enemy who jokes while calling in an airstrike? It made the Germans feel like they were merely props in someone else's game. The lack of radio discipline, the chatter about girls, food, and baseball scores, was technically a security violation. But strategically, it was a display of dominance. It told the Germans, we are not afraid of you. We are so powerful we don't even need to whisper. The casual language of death was the soundtrack of the American advance. It was the sound of a citizen army that refused to become robots, even while operating the most advanced machine of war the world had ever seen. The Germans had the discipline of silence. The Americans had the swagger of noise. And noise won. By 1944, the German command structure was suffering from a fatal vulnerability. It was tethered. Because they lacked sufficient radios, German headquarters relied on the telephone. They laid thousands of miles of field wire through the forests of France and Belgium. To the German mind, wire was secure. It couldn't be jammed. It couldn't be intercepted easily. But wire has a physical weakness: it can be cut. The French resistance and Allied commandos waged a war against the wire. At night, they would sneak into the forests and snip the lines. The result was catastrophic for the German generals. During the Battle of Normandy, entire panzer divisions were left waiting for orders that never came. General Rommel often had to leave his headquarters and drive to the front personally just to find out what was happening. While he was driving, he was out of touch. He was useless. The American system was wireless. It was a self-healing network. If a radio operator was killed, another radio took his place on the net. If a frequency was jammed, they switched to another channel. There were no wires to cut. German commanders found themselves commanding ghosts. They would issue an order to hold a town, only to find out 2 days later that the town had fallen and the unit had retreated because they never received the stand-fast order. The fog of war blinded the Germans, while the Americans had a clear view. This disconnect led to the encirclement at Falaise. Hitler sent orders via radio, Renigma, to hold ground. But the local commanders, cut off from their subordinates by severed telephone lines, couldn't coordinate the defense. The American commanders, meanwhile, were talking to each other across corps boundaries. "Hey, First Army, this is Third Army. We are closing the pincers. Watch your fire." They coordinated a complex encirclement in real time. The German chain of command became a series of broken links. They realized too late that relying on physical infrastructure in a mobile war is suicide. The wire was their lifeline, and the Americans, and their allies, simply cut it. In military science, there is a concept called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The side that completes this loop fastest wins. The radio gave the US Army an OODA loop that was terrifyingly fast. Consider the counter-battery or duel. A German artillery battery fires on American troops. German loop: the German observer sees the target. He writes a note. He gives it to a runner. The runner runs 10 minutes to the battery. The battery calculates. They fire. Total time, 15 to 20 minutes. American loop: the American radar or observer detects the German gun flash. He radios the Fire Direction Center, FDC. The FDC computes the solution in seconds using the graphical firing table. They radio the guns. They fire. Total time, 2 to 3 minutes. This speed difference meant death. German artillery crews would fire a salvo, and before their shells even hit the ground, American counterfire was already in the air, heading toward them. German gunners began to fear firing their own weapons. "If we shoot," they said, "the Americans answer instantly." The radio compressed time. It allowed the Americans to mass fires from batteries miles apart onto a single target within moments. German tank attacks were often broken up before they even crossed the line of departure. Why? Because an American spotter plane saw the dust, radioed the coordinates, and the artillery fired immediately. The German commanders couldn't react. By the time they realized they were under fire and tried to order a retreat, their tanks were already burning. They were fighting in slow motion against an enemy moving at the speed of light. The artillery loop was the mathematical proof of radio dominance. It didn't matter if the German tanks were better. It didn't matter if their guns were bigger. The Americans were faster. And in war, speed kills. As the German army retreated into the borders of the Reich, the radio took on a new, sinister role. It became a voice of torment. German soldiers, hunkered down in freezing bunkers, would tune their captured radios to American frequencies. They hoped to catch intelligence. Instead, they caught the American Forces Network, AFN. They heard Glenn Miller. They heard jazz. They heard baseball scores. They heard the sounds of a society that wasn't struggling. The music was crisp. The announcers were cheerful. It drove home the hopelessness of their situation. While the German radio played Wagner and solemn speeches about ultimate victory, the American radio played swing music. It implied that for the Americans, the war was just a job. It wasn't an existential crisis. They were beating Germany while tapping their feet. German intelligence officers listening to tactical nets heard something even worse. They heard the Americans complaining about too much turkey at Thanksgiving. They heard them griping about that excessive mail they had to sort. To a German soldier eating sawdust bread and waiting for a letter that never came, this was psychological torture. It broke their will. They have so much, a German prisoner told his captors, that they complain about the surplus. The radio breached the walls of the German mind. It told them that resistance was futile. It told them that the enemy was rich, happy, and coming for them. The psychological siege was invisible, but it entered the German foxholes just as effectively as the artillery. Men surrendered because they wanted to go to the land of jazz and turkey. The radio had become the Pied Piper of the Western Front. When the war ended, the fields of Europe were littered with the debris of the Wehrmacht. Rusted helmets, broken rifles, twisted metal. But amongst the wreckage lay the symbols of the American victory. Discarded batteries, broken antennas, handsets. The United States had produced millions of radios. They had wired the world. The German officer who had seized the radio in the Ardennes forest had seen the future. He had seen the death of the warrior and the birth of the network. The U.S. Army proved that information is the ultimate ammunition. A bullet can kill one man. A radio message can kill a regiment. The Germans had bet on the individual excellence of their soldiers. The Americans bet on the collective intelligence of their network. Every American soldier was a sensor. Every radio was a node. The German army was a collection of blind giants. The American army was a single, seeing organism. The legacy of this victory is the modern world. Today, every soldier carries a radio. Every tank is networked. We live in the age of information warfare. It started in the mud of World War II, with a hand-a-toolkit and a bored voice calling in the thunder. The Germans mocked the chatterbox army. They laughed at the noise. But in the end, that noise was the sound of their own defeat. The frequency of victory was American. And it was broadcasting loud and clear.